Okay. The Talisman by Stephen King and Peter Straub is a 1984 epic horror fantasy coming of age road adventure novel. 720 pages long. I'll tell you right now, me personally, I give this a 9.5 out of 10. Almost perfection. I have so much to say. Let's see how concise I can make this review because, as you can tell, I ramble a lot and I have a lot of opinions and I don't make an outline for reason of trying to be more authentic most of the time unless it's a book that I worship, like the Dark Tower series or something. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. So, basically, ignore the flashing lights. The Talisman, this book will not in and of itself keep you safe against demons and evil spirits and vampires and such. Basically, what really sells... Oh my gosh. Shut up. What really sells the story, the biggest takeaway of all for me personally, what makes it memorable, is the heart, the emotional oomph, because the intentions, which are at the same time the thing that propels the long journey to a satisfying emotional climax by the end, is also what separates it from most fantasy horror or fantasy or books of this type, which are more along the lines of not so much, I would say, fine art, despite being written to almost pretty much literary level, the prose being so good, but more so along the lines of pop culture. What separates it from those is that there is a timeless moral quality appeal that just has to do with love, familial love. In this case, it's the sacrifice that the hardship of this journey requires of the main character to save someone. And so, essentially, the second biggest take. Why do I say essentially so much? The second biggest takeaway, the really other biggest memorable quality, is the ability for King and or Straub to write. I don't know how it works with when two authors collaborate. If one wrote one chapter, then the other one outlined, and then one did the writing part. It feels like Stephen King wrote the whole thing. I couldn't tell. I'd never read something from this other guy. I will in the future. But the second biggest takeaway is just the amazingly immersive, believable magic system of there being another dimension which emulates or layers our own dimension, and then there's these supposed synchronicity points. For example, something happens in this world, it happens differently in a sort of upside down or world or shadow world or a world that's layered with this, which is a reoccurring theory that I think is in our collective human subconscious because it represents something real that science isn't able to explain. Similar things have appealed to Stephen King, and even is meta in the way that he writes about them. He's interested in the potential powers of the human mind, especially the subconscious and the creative subconscious, and like things like psychic abilities are a huge theme in a lot of his books. Well, this is one of the most impressive renderings in terms of imagination, of just being able to almost believe that such a thing could be possible because it's so eerily familiar to anyone that's actually been opened their mind or been interested or felt something in certain places in the past, especially in America, that's had a sort of certain charm that you couldn't really explain, more or less usually associated with shadowy characters from more impoverished places, such as your local traveling homeless drunk who's actually an interdimensional wizard of great power from several dimensions and has a long history of doing this or that for, you know, like basically presenting the idea that the world is much bigger than you originally thought and extends to other worlds. There are other worlds than these, that sort of thing. And so it is definitely, I think, worthy of weird fic, whatever you call it, weird fiction, like classic stuff, like stuff that like Robert E. Howard or Michael Moorcock would have wrote, that you have to question, like, is there a spiritual component of an undiscernible of spirits and spirits that inspire that have a sort of non-discernible moral designation, or whatever you call it, designation, quality, intention, moral intention, sorry about that. So that in and of itself makes it eerie, not so much scary. Now, horror fans who are wanting a more quicker paced, genuinely terrorizing experience are not going to find it here. I think that was one of the main complaints and disappointments, which would be relevant to horror fans now looking for Stephen King, like expecting that these two then at the time extremely scary famous horror writers collaborate on something that they were assumed to be a horror novel. This is not in spirit a horror novel. It's a dark fantasy epic coming of age road adventure story with horror in it sometimes. And so the horror, when it does show up, is a lot of fun. It's just so so badass and so well conceived, and it's not so much chilling as it is disturbing, and it really packs a punch like other King works. As we all know, it's that familiarity, that understanding of the audience and the place and the time and the dialogue and the details, and just the no holds barred, non-romantic look at things like violence. When Stephen King presents violence, it is what it is. He presents the information without censorship, and that in and of itself is fascinating in the way he writes so honestly about something that he intrigues in, which is an experience that is genuinely other, that you wouldn't normally otherwise have. A lot when other authors try to write it, it often doesn't feel real, or it's feeling over exaggerated, or it's feeling underplayed to try to censor it. But overall, King's really good at just telling it as it is, as it happens in his mind, which makes it just so much more immersive than the average story. So if there's a scarcity of horror out there, there's just something you could fall back on, like quality horror. But overall, it was like a bit of false advertising trying to get people to buy this and read this, I believe, at the time, because it's not scary. Not really, but it's fun, and there's some good gore in moments. But the really big takeaways is just the heart, the journey, the friendship, the characters, and the overall the sheer power of the imagination, just the mind-opening possibilities of if a human being is able to conceive such a realistic version, such a powerful illusion of a supposed magic system, like moving yourself to and from another dimension which mirrors this dimension. I got some like Majora's Mask vibes, big ones from, that sort of dark magic. It makes you think like it has to be either based on something, because there had to be a reference point or some spiritual entity guiding the subconsciouses of the writers, or they know something about the universe that I don't, which want to know, which my subconscious wants to know, which also compels me to read fantasy that's actually good like this. And so overall, and also the journey of the main character, the character arc, is really genuine, and I don't want to give anything away because it's really worth it to get to the end. But a criticism, it does take its time. As I said before, a lot of modern readers with attention spans of little parakeets are not going to make it. They're not going to get to the end, just like they they don't get to the end of the Dark Tower. They never reach the Dark Tower. And so, this is very similar to the Dark Tower, but it's more like a PG version. Not a PG version, just PG, more PG in spirit, in the sense that this is like what this is to The Hobbit, The Dark Tower is to The Lord of the Rings, if that makes sense. In some ways, I like this better than The Dark Tower. There's a certain amount of charm and less sense of drama and less sense of darkness and tragedy in this book, that and just makes and the main characters more human and endearing in many ways. And also in many ways there's a better sense of humor that is just really dry and really sardonic that King is also known for, that's kind of like interweaved through the background of certain things. It's just extremely satisfying in certain parts, just the way King writes. And at the same time, it doesn't feel like the narrator is ever really present, because it's just so well, he just knows how to write characters. And anyway, but The Dark Tower is a masterpiece of its own kind that is so totally out of this world and so original and so complex that it's a I'm not ready at this point to make review videos for that book series. It might be my favorite fantasy book series of all time. So it's hard to compare this to anything. I was using that comparison because there's just really original enough that there's nothing really to compare it with. It also has a very Mark Twain, like, sort of Americana spirit about it, like that. Familiar could be comforting, could be a huge turn off to people, but like that sort of blue collar, gritty, like realism of that is just universally relatable to anyone that's ever struggled through anything, struggled being companions with someone who, like in an outing of some kind, or a camping trip, who was just like difficult to deal with, being stuck in Sunday school or some environment that's just really just punishingly boring and unfair, or someone that's ever really cared about someone and struggled to like make sure they were okay at a certain point if they had a certain illness. In this case, it's cancer. It's all just so familiar. This is one of those books that sort of knows you. This is like so nostalgic and so human and so honest and so just pure and genuine in the way it presents any given thing. If it's a section that has action, violence, gore, or if there's a section in which there's just this really simple, beautiful nuance between a bunch of guy friends that are on an adventure, it kind of just sneaks up on you. And so there's a lot of ups and downs. It's just it really is an epic journey, an epic fantasy journey that probably a lot of people reading a book by Stephen King were not expecting. And just also a very impressive hybridization of genres, that especially in terms of setting and getting you to imagine there being magic in the day-to-day, mundane, ordinary aspects of the world. I absolutely loved that. That's what makes it really original. Not your typical Stephen King story. It's in its own way a classic, especially has that sort of quality that's like an 80s dark fantasy movie. Like it perfectly, like as I was envisioning certain moments in my mind, I was seeing it through 80s movie special effects, and that is like another level of magic that I just don't know how to explain. So a work of genuine magic, genuine originality. A lot of modern readers are going to find it really slow, not particularly scary, but the story and the heart and the imagination and just the genuine badassness of certain moments totally more than makes up for that, and is probably going to win over people in the long run. The characters are memorable, stay with you for the rest of your life, that kind of story. And then it's also quite emotional and has a very heroic, genuine, universally understood underlying human motivation that is really about friendship and family, that you really don't expect in a very like pop culture type pulp pulpy type of novel that Stephen King, that's more of a guilty pleasure that Stephen King usually writes. And so this book has a surprising amount of heart, and that has made it maybe at this point in my life in my top 20 books of all time at this point. I don't know if it's absolutely essential reading or if I've just become spoiled on great stories that I my expectations are too high, because I've read some of the best books ever written. But yeah, I give this a 9.5. Definitely recommend it. Read it.